Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to stand up a little bit because I see that there's no perspective. My name is Americo Castilla. I founded TIPA Foundation, and I was one of the promoters of this meeting a little over a year ago. And this has moved on and has been driven extraordinarily by the universities that were just presented and TIPA Foundation, and we have great expectations that we will be able to work together throughout the day today. Right now, my work at TIPA has been interrupted because I'm actually the Secretary of National Patrimony at the Ministry of Culture. So I really hope I can go back to TIPA soon enough in order to continue doing this kind of events. Anyhow, the topic today is public space, and this first roundtable, we decided to call it Public Space as a Critical Forum for the 21st Century. Agora is understood as a space for collaboration and for the exchange of ideas. But in addition to that, it's also a territory for visibility and transparency. The public space can either create trenches, as you know it, where every one of us can actually hold on to their biases, or it can stimulate proximity and build bridges that will allow us to better understand diversity. In this context, museums do have this opportunity of contributing critical, innovative values to this social space. However, when we talk about visibility and transparency, in my view, the public space evidences all social differences, demographic circumstances, age differences, so much so that it explores inequalities. There is a predominant sound world, and contrarily to the virtual and social media environments where you can actually simulate personalities, you may build characters anonymously, the space spectacle has already begun when we arrive with our presence, and all encounters are already taken place. No matter what we do, the show is on through all the people that are involved and interact in that public space. The thickness of the sidewalk, urban signaling, urban architecture, the rumor of every conversation, all the whispers, footsteps, everything creates those waves of sound that we ride every day. It is a space and sound matter that is different from one city to another, and the absence of which in non-labor days is something that immediately comes to our attention. People walk and create circuits, domination circuits, we could say, and without even thinking of it, they create digital data that are transmitted from their cell phones to huge control boards, color lines saturated by those urban trajectories going to and from work. Millions of data that surround billboards, digital advertising, signage, and green spaces, bells, sirens. They all echo the silence of all silent marches as those to pay tribute to Attorney Nisman or other claims that are heard throughout the streets. Only flaneurs are aware of these composition, in the same way as the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, creates this intertwined culture. The Memorial Day in Washington, D.C. wraps the city with the roaring of motorbikes, or covers with poppies that Great Britain that remembers their own dead. We know that an idea does not find its shape, and it finds it very hard to thrive until it's founded. The Central Gardens in the Washington Mall were the place where they managed to shape a demonstration against racial discrimination in the United States. 50 years after that, a new shape has surfaced. The Museum of African American Culture in that same mall where that demonstration took place 50 years ago. How was it that the space acquired such a leading role in that space? Debbie Mack here with us was one of the persons in charge of shaping that space, of shaping that African American art and culture. So it is a true honor to have her here today and to ask her what were the critical and innovative values that were actually materialized in that space. Before she answers, though, I would like to advance that Debbie is the Deputy Director for Community Services of the African American History and Culture Museum, a Smithsonian Museum, and among other things, she had developed programs with international organizations to get to this point. And she engages in collaboration programs to build connections between this culture and this museum effectively with others. She has a PhD and a master's degree in anthropology by Northwestern University and a bachelor degree in anthropology from the University of Chicago. So, Debbie, let me sit down first. Tell us about this special situation of this museum on the mall. How do you believe that public space contributed to shaping this idea of social justice?
Can everyone hear me? Thank you. Thank you, Mecca. The public, most people believe that our museum was a 10 or 15-year effort. In reality, the request for this museum began 100 years ago. The first official request to the Congress, and for every 5 to 7 to 10 years for a century, African Americans continued to make this request, and it became enacted for the first time in planning phases about 20 years ago, very actively about 10 years ago. But the site was not determined. There is a very rigorous federal process because it is one of the 19 museums of the Smithsonian system, and so it is heavily regulated. And the teams of people, especially led by our architect, Phil Freelon, the chief architect, had incredible hurdles to claim a space which others did not want the museum to be on. There were 6 or 7 other recommended sites, but this was the site that was requested for very historical reasons. Number one, because of its presence on the National Mall, and at the site of the demonstrations from 1968, 1965, the 1940s. It was recognized as a site of national and international visibility and prominence. But also, the museum is actually situated on what was a plantation, a slave plantation, historically. Before there was a national mall, it was a place, this particular site, where people of African descent and African Americans were enslaved as property. And we wanted to claim that space and turn it on its head. And we were able, as a team, to succeed in that. And so that piece of memory, that piece of history, and if you do not know the history of that, the significance is lost. One of the goals of this museum is to reclaim and make very visible this history in very accessible ways to people who may have more immediate or less immediate claims. It's in a sense a cultural landscape, and I'm seeing Walter Hood here in front of me, who has been a very prominent national and international figure in reclaiming cultural landscapes, whether they are rural or urban, and this is an urban and national landscape. And so placement was very, very important. The actual building construction materials, the process of who built, the actual work people, men and women, who actually contributed to the construction of it, was a global community, and they competed to work on this particular museum because of its significance as an American landmark. The building itself, and I'll let others speak to that, in terms of its design, references African American architectural elements that are vernacular, common, ordinary elements, but that mean something to African Americans in particular. So all of these elements in combination were important, but the museum spent 2 years before it did anything asking people what they wanted, what they needed, what stories needed to be told, how it needed to be presented, how those stories, who should be presented, because this was to represent the aspirations of more than 100 years of requests. And so we felt that there was a strong responsibility to legacy, to, in a sense, our ancestors, and those who will come to continue that memory in very visible ways.
Gracias, Debbie.
Thank you, Debbie. There's many questions. I can think of many questions. In fact, the interpreter can. So, for those of you who haven't been to Washington, it's very hard to compare it to something in particular, but it could be the 9th of July Avenue or one of those central avenues where you find a social issue. You can actually see it. Everything that is connected with HIV and AIDS in the United States, the big demonstrations, all of them took place at the Washington Mall. But I'd like for Nicolas Testoni, director of the Ferro White Museum. It's a workshop museum, Ferro White, which is a community museum of a small city in the south of Buenos Aires, actually quite to the south. It's almost 800 kilometers from here, close to Bahia Blanca, a port area, and with few resources but a great sense of imagination, created together with a team of experts. They created an attraction venue where interested people in a new way of museum actually visit the site to get to know how creativity can create a social effect of relevance. Amongst other awards, and together with the Toy Museum, he received what we call the Conoration Prize at the museum, organized by the Foundation TIPA in Argentina and the American Alliance of Museums in the United States, within the framework of reimagining the museum here in Buenos Aires last year. Nicolas, the landscape in which the Ferro White Museum operates, the landscape not just from a space point of view, but from a cultural and social perspective as well. To which extent does it influence the ideas that you're developing? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Yes? Yes? Can you hear me now? No? Yes. Way better now. It does have to do in great deal. I don't have great news to break from Ingeniero White, the port of Bahia Blanca, where I come from, because Ingeniero White is a space where the notion of public space cannot be actually taken for granted. We are not sure that there is a public space as such. We are actually convinced to the contrary. Public space in Ingeniero White these days needs to be created. And our museum, or one of the objectives of the museum, of our workshop museum, needs to exhibit and manufacture these spaces. In the first place, when we first started, Ferro White was actually something, some tools, some obsolete tools that were actually sold as junk tools that some people working for the railroad decided to steal last century actually from the state-owned company that was intended to be privatized. And we intended then to make this a public space. But together with this project, we were under the suspicion that the memory of that past that these tools bring with them have some kind of influence in the present and the future. And these things cannot be just stuck within the walls of a museum. So Ferro White was actually the building assigned to it, but it's also what happens outside of this building. And this is when we started to think of devices to stroll, to walk around the area, to get on the train, as Americo mentioned, which we did last year, a train that, by the way, is not under operation anymore. So what does it have to do all this with a great transformation, a historical process of great scale that has to do with how to reproduce and consume in a place like Ingeniero White in the 60s of last century, actually, when we talked about the night of Ingeniero White at the port, they were referring to the parties in bars and cabarets. But today, Ingeniero White doesn't sleep at night, but its night is quite different. But it has to do with productive processes that are automatized, that are related to the territory and its regime of entries and exits with a very strict process. And is that the place? Is this the place to open a museum? It is quite difficult. And this is where we tried. We actually tried in a place related to the museum of Ingeniero White, which actually was born 30 years ago. Our Ferro White is only 12 years old, but it's a great experience for us and to know that we are in this fight for these past 30 years. So within one of the things that we decided, and since we are today in a place related to spirituality, I'd like to tell you that in Ferro White we invented a saint for us because we didn't find within the Catholic religion a saint for the public space. So I'd like to ask for the introduction of San Atilio or Saint Atilio. He represents the spirit that represents the spirit of some of designers, but also the will of relating to the depth of our feelings and needs. My colleague Guillermo is giving out cards. I'd like to share these with my colleagues here. Just a minute, please. And very briefly, to wrap up, I'd like to read one of these prayers, and you can pray with me if you feel like it. Saint Attilio, you the dreamer, you that you know that Ingeniero White in its depth, please pray for our water and air purification, the life of the fish and our animals in the sea, and also in San Martin, which is our source of energy and light, which enlightens our ideas, our hearts, the state, and our communities. We request, we pray, and we say all of this with great respect. Amen. We will actually collect some money later on. Thank you very much. I believe Nicolas' intervention gives us a picture of the spirit of his museum. And now I'd like to introduce Helen Marriage. This is even starting from its name, artichoke. I'm not sure whether it's art and choke or artichoke altogether. But we believe that the artichoke is an appropriate product to introduce Ellen Marriage. It's quite an unusual vegetable that we can only get at a certain time of the year, at least in our countries. And she is, I believe, a very special person who goes from one extreme to the other extreme of the significance of the social concepts within a community. And among other things, she's the artistic director of Artichoke, which is one of the leading independent art companies in the UK. And its work actually is recognized in many other countries. The Lumiere Festival that took place to the north of the UK, which is a very cold area, was created for Artichoke to create the power of light. And these days, it is an event that was reproduced in London and Northern Ireland. Artichoke's projects are just there at the conjunction of art, politics, and communication. And they achieve high impact in the public through the disruption they create in their daily lives. Helen graduated from the Graduate School of Design, and in 2006 she received the honors award in the UK, and within the artistic field she is or we believe she is in great equilibrium, and she's always ready to disrupt this equilibrium in a great way every time she intervenes. So Helen, I believe public space is your field, especially because of the kind of interventions you make. Maybe you can share with the group here a bit more of your insights on your public participation, public work, and how would you define this public space that you intervene?
That's a very big question. Artichoke, unusually for this group of people, doesn't ever have a building, own a building, or want to function within an institution. We love the fact that those institutions exist because they provide for us the framework, the catalyst, the theatre that we can use to engage the broadest possible public. The aim of Artichoke is to take the imagination of an artist. We always work with an artist at the centre of our projects, and to allow them, our job is to create a platform for their work to be seen in the most democratic way by the broadest possible public. So everything we do is free to the public. It always invades public space in a way that is deliberately disruptive. So projects like the famous Royal Deluxe, who came, I think they've been here in Argentina, but we closed London, a world city, for 4 days to produce their work it took 7 years to, almost as long as Debbie's last phase of her museum, it took 7 years to persuade the authorities in London that the streets could be returned to pedestrians, that could be returned to residents and visitors, that this compact that we all agree with, that we implicitly agree with, that cities are for trade, traffic, and work, that could be interrupted for a moment. So being English, when you turn up and you're me and you say, hey guys, always guys I have to say, could we just close these streets for 4 days? And they say, no. And I say, but why not? And they say, what's it in aid of? That's a very English expression. What's it in aid of? What's the purpose? Is it celebrating something? Is it commemorating something? Is it has to have an agenda? And I say, it would just be great. No. So the conversation goes on for 4 years, 5 years. Me saying, please, may I? Because I'm very polite. And then I realized this was the wrong question. And the question I was asking, please, may I, of people whose jobs were to maintain the routine of daily life in that city. Not one of them was it possible to say, yes, we sanction this, because to say that might be to take responsibility for something that was beyond their capabilities. So one day, not because I was clever, but because I was irritated, I said in this meeting, the Please May I meeting that I'd been going to for years and years, I said, this event is happening on these days. How can you help me? And at that point, the conversation completely changed. Everybody decided somehow that someone else had sanctioned the closing of central London for 4 days, because everybody wanted it to happen. They were just frightened of taking responsibility. So collectively, we all decided that nobody had taken responsibility in that room, but somehow this was going to happen. And at this point, the argument changed from why would we do this to why wouldn't we do this? That strange tipping point where people agree on a course of action that they know is unorthodox, they know it's strange, but they really want it. And then suddenly in 2006, Royal Deluxe came. The show consisted of a giant 3-story high mechanical elephant which walked the streets of London. It was 9 months after the bombings of July the 7th, when people were still very nervous about being seen in public space. Big conglomerations of people made people anxious. And yet, unannounced, 1 million people came out onto the streets and occupied the areas that are usually given over to political ceremonies, royal moments of anniversaries, things very often that celebrate winning something, a war, a cricket match, the arrival of the American president, all these things for which we think closing the roads are normal, which are permitted, which are called events of national significance. Suddenly there was a different kind of event of national significance, which was about joy, delight, magic, wonder, awe. And that really has transformed the landscape in London and in the UK for the use of public space by artists to express things that are inexpressible in other ways.
It's very common in the city. It is very common in the city to see the public space interrupted. I would say that is virtually something that we're completely used to. It's like the norm. But I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about that experience of the giant elephant or any other experience that you put together that you think best reflects this form of intervention.
I guess the thing with the elephant was that it was the first time that London had been used in that way. And it's a world city. It's not an easy... I did understand that it wasn't easy to close the roads to traffic, to suspend all of this stuff. But there are other projects that we've done which are equally impactful, but maybe less disruptive. So has anyone been to London? Does everybody know Trafalgar Square, which is the square in the centre of London? So this is always my test question. What's in Trafalgar Square? Who's been? Okay, hands up. Who's been to Trafalgar Square? Okay, so you get to answer. What's in Trafalgar Square? Nelson's column. What else? Lions, very good. What else? People, fountains.
National Gallery.
National Gallery. Okay, so there's this thing called the fourth plinth. Who's heard of the fourth plinth? So the fourth plinth is a plinth like you'd get in a museum, except it's a platform for temporary contemporary sculpture that goes up every year. So the implication of the fourth plinth is that there are 3 others. So who's been to Trafalgar Square? You're not admitting it now. What's on the other 3? Who even can remember seeing them? So this is a really interesting thing, I think, that the permanent public statues, the things that we memorialize, nobody sees because they're just furniture. So there are 3 military generals on each of those 3 plinths, and then there's an empty one. So Anthony Gormley, very great British sculptor, decided that he was going to do a piece as part of the fourth plinth program that was not a sculpture that sat there for a year, but was 100 days and nights in which a single person would be elevated each hour onto the plinth, and they would get to do whatever they liked. And in this 2,400 hours of people was a portrait of the UK. So we got, I said no 5 times because I knew how hard this was going to be, and then we said okay. And so we got to manage this project. And the contention was that this was a place where the English memorialized their dead military heroes, and what we wanted to do was offer the space to living humans who had things to say, that they had their hour where they were themselves memorialized. It's the longest live outside broadcast anyone's ever done. Everyone was filmed. There's an archive in the British Library of all of those things. Those are the museum-y things that came out of it. But the moment that was really amazing was this moment when the space was occupied by living humans, each of whom had something to say, whether that was a protest or something joyful or a game, or they just sat and read a book. But you got a complete portrait of Britain in the 21st century. It was considered to be a super illegitimate way to use that space, which is very historic and very revered. But actually it was hugely delightful. 9 million people were on the website. It kept crashing because too many people were watching, particularly when the 9 people who decided to take all their clothes off took their clothes off. Website would crash, we'd put it up again. But it was this living way of talking about not only the circumstance of that square and what it's used for, but ownership by a different demographic and something that was about the 21st century.
Extremely interesting for both reasons, right? First of all, because it is a key central space in London, and how museums can choose not to talk only about the past, but also to work with a reflection of the present and with everything that is emerging that has to do with ideas of the future. Generally, many of our museums are devoted to evoking the past, especially in Latin America. Our history museums are strongly related to the military wars of our independence and the development of our nations. And it's often very detached from the day-to-day interests of the people that circulate those spaces. So I will go back to Debbie now. The date on which there were still slaves, slavery was legal in the United States, that wasn't so long ago. It's not 18th century. Slavery in the United States was 20th century. So these new ideas that you're trying to promote in your museum, how do they connect to the daily interest not only of African Americans, but of the multiplicity of communities that are majorities in the United States, such as, I don't know, the Latino community or the Asian community? How do you believe that your museum is an adequate institution to show the conflicts and to show the contrasting ideas such as those that we're witnessing today in this election that was almost a tie in the United States, that also show the very deep ideological differences between one sector and the other.
I'm sorry. The museum references the past as a baseline. One of the I think statements that we can say is that we, in telling the story of our past and our present, and in fact in looking at the future, it is just one way of looking at what the American experience has been within the United States, but in 21st century terms, what it means also globally. We understand in our exhibitions, in our programs, and everything that we do, that our experience is also a diasporic one. And so we have Afro-Latino and Caribbean, et cetera, all kinds of other connections as well. In telling the stories the way that we do, we have some national stories, we have cultural stories, but we also have what we call our community stories, because there's no one monolithic experience, either historically or even today. And those experiences that we narrate are very open-ended, and they are also very much conversations. They are not dictating, in a sense. The most recent presidential elections have really just highlighted how important for all of us, culture making, place making, making the invisible visible, having platforms for discussion can be. Because for many people who may think that, especially the US loves to give a portrayal of this sort of linear direction of progress that's always going forward. The realities for all countries, for all of us, including here in Argentina, is that it's always an issue of being contested, that it can go back, it can go forth, it can sidestep, etc. Our institutions, I think, are places where we feel we can discuss these issues, meet others who are similar and also different around these issues. Our museum is a place where, of course, a majority of the visitors are not of African descent at all. One of the most amazing things for those who I think did not expect it was how globalized our audiences and visitors are. In many ways, things which are seen as an African American, I grew up seeing as African American, are seen as global issues, are seen as contemporary issues. And we find especially younger than me, younger people just see this as part of their own realities in ways that they can connect to. So that these most recent elections have a political representation. My personal belief is that they have very little impact on what we do day in and day out, but we realize we have already become a place where many people can seek answers, they can look for discussions, they can look for places to find connections and more information. We are a place of protest, we are a place of solidarity. Much of our work is also in solidarity and support of things that are global, that are non-African American, because in the 21st century, that's who we are. I served on the advisory committee for the museum for 7 years before I came on staff. And one of my roles was always to ask, in the 21st century, who is an African American? Because we are a global people, and we are part of the larger community. And so we have an historic memory, but it is a shared memory. And our present is also a very shared and global presence. As we look to the future, we are working in all kinds of ways. For instance, as you know, I did a little bit of work early on with TIPA, well, several years ago with TIPA, and that experience has always stayed with me, because TIPA, for me, is one of those organizations that is a change maker. It creates possibility wherever it is. It is open in all kinds of ways to invite people to think differently, and difference is okay. We see it as one of the major partners for us in changing what goes on in this hemisphere and beyond. We hope that we can become a partner of that sort so that no matter what the political circumstances of Argentina today or the US today, the work that we all do in solidarity with each other advances the values that we feel are important. And that has a lot to do with identity and citizenship in a global kind of way, of enabling communities, strengthening individuals, and finding places where they can see themselves. I believe that part of what was problematic for many people in the US, and I feel especially older people, my age and older in the US, is that they felt they were not being heard or being seen. And maybe at this time they feel that is their moment. This is their moment. I think that visibility, that being heard, is something necessary for everyone. And so we just continue in the work we're doing, and we do it with great partners, including Farrah White.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I don't know how are we on time. Should I ask any questions or do we have more time? Because there's actually something that came up, which is consensus, celebrations, and discrepancies, which I believe that public space in certain countries, such as our own, is a space for expressing discrepancy and differences rather than celebrating similarities. Seldom do people get together to celebrate. It's much more frequent to use a public space as a place where people dare, and daring is a very important verb because people dare express their discrepancies, their different voices. So let me tell you, Bahía Blanca is a city where military repression was particularly strong. There is a very prominent navy base, and despite there were some important thinkers with all different types of ideologies, right wing thinking has always been predominant among newspapers and the most representative media in the city. And it is in that place where the Port Museum and the Farrah White Museum emerged to express ideas that go to contradict that dominant way of thinking. So, how can a museum express discrepancy and yet remain alive? I mean, without having to pray to Saint Attilio. It is true, we are some sort of survivors, and it is also true that Bahía Blanca is prejudiced against as a totalitarian city. You will see in the map of the city that there are different military bases around the city, navy, aviation, and army. And next to Punta Alta, next to Ingeniero White, we have the largest military base in the country. That creates a very tough environment for all of us. So I believe that when it comes to expressing a different voice in such a context, you need to be very creative and to have some sense of humor. But this is something that we really need to discuss with every one of my colleagues here. It is also important not to express discrepancies in a void, because what you need to express is a demand that some institutions, as our museum, are attempting to articulate and to make it visible. It's not that there's two or three nutcases that just want to protest against anything. What we do in many cases goes to express some deeper claims. And since they are deep, that somehow goes to legitimate our actions. Anyhow, it's not that it is our job to express discrepancy every single day. The task of the museum involves day to day tasks that spread to other areas. that have to do with our oral history, with our stories of life, but also with day to day things such as inviting someone over to cook at the museum or to manufacture something or to repair an old engine. That all happens at Fair White Museum. And it is our daily work that allows us, in certain special circumstances, to express a different voice. Oddly enough, the place we decided to make our intervention and the one we're going to use as the headquarters for all the workshops that we're going to have is the historic area of our city, the oldest area of our city, the area where black slaves predominated in the city. It was the area where battles were waged between the British Army and the Argentinian Army when the English attempted to invade the city that was actually under siege by the English, and it was later reconquered. And the traces still remain of those bombs, of those canyons that still resonate throughout this part of the city. And we still see some of the bullets in the bells of the St. Domingo Church just 2 blocks away. That tells us how the public space allows to interpret a great deal of the history of the city. So between the City Museum, which is just across the street where we're going to be holding our workshops, which might be the oldest house still standing in the city of Buenos Aires, and we see that this is an area of conflict. This is a neighborhood of encounters. And if we are still here on Sunday, you will see African descendants that still get together playing their drums and get together on Sundays to continue with their habits and customs. So, Helen, we are not at war. I know that you've just arrived in Argentina, so it's very tough to think of interventions. But when they told you you are invited to come to Argentina, you are invited to Buenos Aires. Did you ever think? Because I'm completely sure that you can come up with this thousand ways of intervening in spaces and thinking creatively of spaces. Have you had any fantasy, not those that you cannot share, but any fantasy you can share about this?
I thought we might just reenact the war. No, to be serious. I think that the work that works most successfully in public space of this kind that I have done for the last 30 years is when it's rooted in the history of the place and in the people. So you're not imposing an idea or an ideology, but you're allowing free expression of something which suddenly when people either participate or witness, they recognize the rightness of what's happening. We recently, just in September, did a piece in London, which was very much about the history of London. So the Great Fire of London burnt 75% of the city in 1666. So the displaced people were 80% of the population who had to live in refugee camps outside the city walls. It's hard for the English and Londoners particularly to imagine that kind of decimation. But we were able to create a project which reenacted, we basically created a model of 17th century London and burnt it on the river. But also it was an opportunity to discuss the refugee issues that are very prevalent across Europe at the moment, the questions of displacement, all of the stuff that you might not think about. When you think about the Great Fire, people think about the real estate, but they don't think about the history of those people and what that meant and what losing an entire place meant. So here in Buenos Aires, it would be interesting to understand more about the history and the culture, and then to create something which occupied the streets in a way that was, I guess the word we use most often is transformational, that actually if you can change the physical fabric of a place, if you can change even momentarily what it looks like, you can create impressions and memories that last in people's minds forever. They never see the place in the same way again.
Oh, I lost sound. Can you hear me now? Oh, it's almost time. They tell me that we're out of time to make questions. But I truly believe that we've heard questions at the table that you can go on discussing throughout the days, especially at the workshops. But I thought it was very inspiring to try to kick off this meeting in which we're going to be extremely busy. Thank you very much.